Hello and welcome to the spiritguides.co.uk network radio show with your host Mark Chatterton. Tonight we would like to welcome onto the show Anthony Peake, who has been researching the relationship between the human brain and consciousness for a number of years. Anthony has written 4 books which we will be discussing tonight. As well as being a member of the Society for Psychical Research, he is also a member of the International Association for the Study of Dreams, the International Association of Near-Death Studies, and the Scientific and Medical Network. So a warm welcome to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much. Great to be on the show.
You had your first book, Is There Life After Death, published in 2006. But before we go on to talk about your books, can you tell us what were you doing before this? Had you always had an interest in the paranormal, the unexplained, or did you have a Eureka moment that started you off?
Well, I suppose it's a little bit of both. I've been fascinated by the paranormal phenomena, I suppose, since my very early teens, when I used to get a magazine called Man, Myth, Magic. This is in the late 60s, and I've always been intrigued by how human consciousness relates to reality. And when I was at university, myself and a couple of friends had a very informal psychical research group, and we used to rush around the Warwickshire countryside trying to find haunted pubs and such like. Very much the idea, really, just find a pub, have a few beers and talk about ghosts and things. But I then did my first degree at Warwick University, and then I did postgraduate at the London School of Economics. But my academic career was very much focused on social sciences, whereas my interest in the more marginal areas very much moved into UFOs and such like at that time. But for many, many years, I earned a crust, as it were, as initially an employee relations manager with various companies, and from then on I moved into general human resources management. But I'd always been interested in these subjects. And the interesting thing is, and what has always intrigued me, is that everything I've read over the last, 40-odd years, in effect, I found useful, which is quite strange. It's almost as if I was being guided to write this book at this time. And it's something we can probably touch upon later, this idea of guidance, as it were. And it's something that does intrigue me. But very much, it was only probably around about 10 years ago that I decided that I would fulfill an ambition and write a book. And that first book was Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happened When We Die. And at that stage, I never, ever expected to get a publisher, nor did I ever expect, even if I got a publisher, that anybody other than my immediate family would read it. And here I am now, 35,000 copies later. That first book's now been translated into various foreign languages, including Spanish and Russian and Polish, with new deals coming through all the time. And I just keep having to pinch myself because, it's been a wonderful journey, and it's yet to stop, really.
Oh, that's very interesting. So what was it that prompted you to write the book, Is There Life After Death, then?
That's where it becomes stranger and stranger. I didn't actually know what I was going to write about. All I knew was I'd finished a contract, and I was in the position that I had a little bit of disposable income, and I was in the position that I could spend a year writing. And I had no idea what I was going to write about. I had a vague idea that it was something to do with consciousness and how it relates to reality, but that was about all. And it was quite curious, because on the very first day, I was sitting in front of a blank computer screen at my house then in Horsham in West Sussex, and just a blank word screen, and I thought, what am I going to write about? And the most curious thing happened, because I started to feel quite strange, in the sense that I started getting tingling in the end of my fingers and things. And I immediately recognized this as being the aura state of a migraine attack. Now, I suffer from classical migraine, which is migraine that doesn't necessarily mean a headache, but does mean that you have very, very severe visual disturbances and disruptions, together with sort of very, very curious physiological feelings, like, as I said, my fingers feeling dead, my lips going numb, and all these other things. But something else else very strange happened, because as I looked out the window, I suddenly realized I'd done it before. I'd actually sat at that point, looking at that computer screen, looking at that view. When I came out of the aura state, I was fortunate that a headache didn't then develop. I knew exactly what I was going to write about. I was going to write about the deja vu phenomenon, because I wanted to know exactly what had happened to me and what it was I was experiencing there. Was I experiencing a precognition? Was I experiencing a memory of a previous time I'd done that? What did it signify? And it started me on an incredible adventure, because I very quickly found that deja sensations are very much linked to aura states with migraine. So clearly there was the initial link. So clearly there was some form of neurological link to it. But on top of that, I quite by chance managed to come across an academic paper written by a Swiss researcher by the name of Dr. Arthur Funkhauser. It's not, he's American, but he actually lives in Bern in Switzerland. And he'd written an article entitled The Dream Theory of Deja Vu. And it stunned me when I read this, because what he was suggesting was that a deja vu sensation is the fact that you have, in your immediate past, had a dream. And in reality, you start to live that dream. You know, like sometimes you forget dreams, then suddenly something will trigger you and remind you that you've had a dream. Art's hypothesis is this is what deja vu is. It's a dream you've had that's precognitive. Now, I was in the fortunate position of being able to contact Dr. Funkhauser, and subsequently we've become very good friends, and we've met many times, and he's helped me in a lot of my writing, because by background he's a quantum physicist. So it's actually quite interesting, his background in many, many ways. He's an expert in holography and holograms. And when I met him, when I first spoke to him, I said, your solution is a very intriguing one, but it has a problem, because it suggests that precognition is a reality, that the dreams are precognitions. And he said, yes, it seems to be that there is evidence that we can perceive in certain times the future. This then stimulated me to go off on a tangent, trying to think, well, how can that happen? How can I know the future? How can I know the future in a scientific way? How can I know the future taking into account the way science perceives the world? And around about 6 or 7 months later, I ended up with a new hypothesis about what happens to human consciousness at the point of death. Because, to cut a long story short, what the first book proposes is something I call the cheating the ferryman hypothesis. And what this proposes is that when people have near-death experiences, they report many sensations, going down a tunnel, they report meeting dead people or people they know, they report meeting something called a being of light, they have this idea of floating outside of their body. But one of the other things that is intriguing is something called technically the panoramic life review. And this is the thing where people turn around and say, my life flashed before my eyes. Now, this fascinated me, because I thought, well, if my life flashes before my eyes, that is evidence that my life has been recorded. Because how else could your life flash before your eyes if it wasn't a recording? And I did a lot of research on this and discovered there is fairly strong evidence from neurology that the human brain records every single thing that we experience in our lives. Literally everything. And it encodes it in the brain using holographic principles. And this, again, is not New Age. This is very much based upon some of the work of a guy called Professor Carl Pribram, who was a psychologist who worked at the University of Georgetown in America. Now, if that is the case, that I can record all my life, the question is why? And then I thought, well, this is where it might happen. What may happen is that in a near-death experience, your life flashes before your eyes. But in a real death experience, it doesn't flash. It literally is a minute-by-minute recreation of your life. And that minute-by-minute recreation of your life is like an equivalent of the movie The Matrix. Or indeed, many, many movies deal with this theme. I mean, another classic example of this kind of concept is Vanilla Sky with Tom Cruise. You also have the classic movie Jacob's Ladder. And all of these deal with the idea of encountering your whole life in the final seconds of your life. But if you encounter it in a recreation of your life, in this final second of your life, where time dilates, because one of the other things that's known in near-death experience is that time slows down. You know, you've probably experienced it, and I'll guarantee a lot of your listeners have experienced that sensation when you've been involved in a car crash or an accident, or you've been given bad news, where time suddenly slows down. This is, again, a known neurological effect, and it's triggered by a substance in the brain called glutamate. Glutamate is the major neurotransmitter of the mammalian brain. It's a chemical that facilitates communication between the neurons of the brain. It is known that glutamate floods the brain at the point of death. So in which case, you fall out of time, so suddenly time is completely different for you, and in that new time, you live your whole life again. Now, while you're living that whole life again, there are occasions when you remember the fact that you've been here before. That's Deja sensation. The Deja phenomenon, by the way, Deja vu means already seen. Deja vécu, which is the more correct term, is already lived. So literally, when you have a precognition, what you're doing is actually remembering a memory. Now, and this is where it becomes intriguing for your listeners, because in my second book, I take one of the factors of the first book. In my second book, A Daimon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, I suggest that when you're living your life again, there is a part of you that remembers the fact you're living your life again and knows what's going to happen, not only next, but through the whole of your life. This being is your higher self. This being is your spirit guide. This is your guardian angel. This is your genius, as the ancient Romans said, or your daemon, as the ancient Greeks called it. This being knows what's going to happen. It is equivalent to a game player in a three-dimensional video game. The game player in a video game, say you're playing something like, I don't know, Tomb Raider, and you're following Lara Croft down the passages, and as she goes down a passage, some big, huge creature comes out and kills her. What happens? You go back to the start, don't you? And you start again. But this time, you, as the game player, know that there's going to be a huge creature that's going to come out and kill her. So you don't go down that corridor, and you go somewhere else. Now, you will rightly turn around to me and say, but hold on a minute, I thought you said we were living in a recording of our life. We are. But the recording that we exist in is not just the recording of our life. It's the recording of every life we could possibly live, as in a computer game. Because in a computer game, every alternative decision that is made by you as the game player is encoded onto the DVD that you're playing and using. It's already encoded. There is no future, there is no past in a computer game. There just is the moment as you pass through it. The reality is rendered second by second as you play the game. Now, in order to accommodate this, I go into quantum physics, and we won't have time here, but if anybody's interested in quantum physics and the background to the quantum physics I'm dealing with here, I'm actually citing something called the Everett's many worlds interpretation of particle physics, which was proposed by a guy called Hugh Everett III in 1957, which was his PhD paper. But this suggests that there are literally trillions of versions of all of us, and each version of us lays down a different life record. And in laying down those life records, it encodes all that information. And I also believe, and this is something I'm working on in my next book, is that all this information is encoded in something called the 0-point field, which is the equivalent of the Akashic record. It is something that contains the record of everything that ever can happen, everything that will happen, and everything that can possibly happen. Are you all with me so far?
Yeah, one thing that's come up from that is, what about the idea of predestination? Does that, is that one possible thing, or would you argue that that doesn't sort of come into it at all?
Well, predestination suggests that there's only one route you can take, isn't it? If I'm predestined to do something, it means that I am trapped in following this particular route. However, if I'm living in this recreation of all my lives, which I technically call the Bohemian